Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at one of the Lugers that is going to be in their upcoming April of 2020 premiere auction. Now, this isn't a standard typical Luger. This is an artillery Luger. I should point out that that name was never actually formally used by the Germans. This was known as an LP08, Lange pistole, a long pistol, model of 1908. And it originates with a requirement or a desire of the German Artillery Corps to replace their incredibly obsolete Reichsrevolvers, the 1879 and 1883 Reichsrevolvers, for the field artillery. Now, there are a couple different forms of artillery in the German military when this is going down. They have the field artillery, which is basically light artillery, 75mm guns and things in about that range that are intended to keep up with the infantry and provide fire support. And then you have the foot artillery, which is basically the heavy artillery, heavier guns, siege mortars, that sort of thing. They're a separate branch of the service. You then also have some stuff like coastal defense artillery. The artillery Luger here was developed specifically for the field artillery, the light, fast-moving guys. And the Reichsrevolver had been a nice, handy, compact weapon for them, but it was tremendously obsolete. The heavier artillery guys were using carbines. They had things like the Gewehr 91, which is basically a carbine version of the Commission 1888 rifle. And they would keep those until they transitioned to Mauser 98s and other things later on. But what's really interesting to me is the creativity and sort of the unorthodox nature of what the German military came up with for the light artillery. So this question first came up in 1907 when the artillery decided that they specifically wanted a pistol caliber carbine. They tested the options that were out there at the time, which were the C96 Mauser, the broom handle, the Frommer, interestingly, and the Borchardt, which is, of course, the predecessor to the Luger. At this point, there are no Luger carbines. They're just Luger pistols, and they have been developed from the larger Borchardt. The Borchardt was available from the very beginning with a shoulder stock because it was a kind of big and clumsy pistol that was much better suited to being a carbine. Well, in 1907, none of these guns really were adequately suitable for the German artillery, and they didn't adopt any. The question came up again, however, after, in 1908, the standard Luger was adopted as the Pistole 08, the German military sidearm. So the project gets dropped in the lap of a guy named Captain Adolf Fischer, and by 1913, he and his team, developing what would be this, the LP08. 1913, it's formally approved by Kaiser Wilhelm II, ready to go into production. Like 1912, 1913, they build about 50 of them. Production doesn't really start until World War I begins. It's approved before World War I begins, but there isn't really any huge urgency to get things moving until the war kicks off, understandably. Right at the beginning, these would be put into production by two different firms. DWM would build them through the very end of the war and produce about 155,000 total. And then the Royal Erfurt Arsenal also began production in 1914, but only produced them for about the first year of the war. And they would produce a total of about 23,000. So we're looking at about 180,000 of these total manufactured during World War I. Now, the more interesting part to me is what ended up happening to this gun. So first off, it's an interesting and creative solution to an artillery armament. Like you want a handy gun, you want something that's going to be lightweight and easy to carry around without getting in the way of these guys whose real job is keeping up with 75mm field guns and supporting the infantry. But because they are supporting the infantry, they're absolutely going to be in positions from time to time where they're overrun by enemy troops and they have to actually use small arms in self-defense. So they need something that has firepower, but also a lot of portability. And it's interesting that the Germans were kind of the only ones to recognize the potential of a semi-automatic pistol with a shoulder stock and a long barrel to work in this role. You can see that there's a leather holster strapped onto the shoulder stock here. This whole holster assembly goes right on your belt, pistol goes in the holster, and it's barely larger than a typical service sidearm. However, you can detach the thing if you need it, attach the shoulder stock, and that gives you a third point of contact for shooting. As a semi-automatic pistol, it offers a tremendous increase in firepower compared to either a standard pistol that's harder to shoot accurately at range, or a bolt-action rifle, which may be much more powerful, but is also much slower to use. And it's this flexibility and this kind of unprecedented level of firepower for the time that would lead to the artillery Luger being thrown into a bunch of other situations that it wasn't originally designed for, but at which it did pretty well. So these guns would be picked up by aviators, right, honestly, from the very beginning of the war, because, well, for the same reasons. They offer a lot of firepower without having to manually work an action, which is, of course, difficult to do when you're flying around in a rickety World War I era aircraft. In that role, they would be replaced by machine guns within a couple years, but where Allied pilots had handguns or maybe shotguns, German pilots and observers had this, which really kind of blurs the line and gives them a lot of firepower. More distinctively, I think, is its adoption by the Sturmtruppen. So a couple years into the war, Germany develops a concept, and they're not the only ones, but they develop the concept they call the Sturmtruppen, the storm troops, the assault troops, whose job is to basically infiltrate enemy lines, make use of cover, open order tactics, and deliver fast, hard-hitting attacks where they're maybe not anticipated. These troops have to be mobile, they have to be flexible, and they have to have as much firepower as possible. And they realize that, hey, we've got these really long Gewehr 98 Mauser rifles. Those aren't so great. Well, we've also got the shorter Kar 98 AZ carbines intended for, say, the heavy artillery troops. Those are better, but you know what? The field artillery have these little pistol caliber carbines, and you don't have to work the action. You've got more ammunition in them than a bolt action rifle to begin with. And it's at that point, in 1916, that the drum magazine is introduced for the artillery Luger, specifically for the storm troops. This is a magazine that holds 32 rounds. They did, by the way, experiment with full auto versions of the artillery Luger. They never went anywhere. The Luger is just not really set up well to be a fully automatic firearm. The reciprocating components are far too light. It has reliability issues in full auto. It fires very, very fast. Those experiments never went anywhere, and frankly, for the Sturmtruppen, semi-auto is kind of just the right blend of accuracy and firepower. So with these drums, and they made a lot of these drums, by the way, about 900,000 of them over the course of the war, and they issued them out, initially at least, at a rate of 10 of these drums for every gun. So you'd basically have a guy carrying a pile of drums for the guy in front of him who had an artillery Luger to keep the guy supplied. And with these, they become this really interesting and kind of unique firearm. You'll see the United States, well, the Allies, the whole Entente, trying to emulate this a little bit with the Pedersen device, which never saw service, and that's probably a good thing because it was not a reliable system. But the Germans have this combination of compact assault firepower that's really pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at some of the features of this because I've rambled on for quite some time about it already. Let's start out with just the pistol, which is fundamentally simply a Luger pistol. 9mm parabellum caliber. Lugers were, of course, also made in 7.65 parabellum, but all of the German military contracts were for 9mm. The barrel has been stretched out to 8 inches, or about 200 millimeters. We have a tangent rear sight graduated out to 800 meters, and it can be zeroed. You can zero it for elevation right there. You see that little screw with the 2 holes. That allows you to adjust the rear notch up and down. It is also adjustable for windage via the front sight. You can see a similar screw adjustment out there. The markings are basically going to be the same as standard German P08 Lugers. So we have a date stamp over the chamber. This is 1917, which tells us that it will have been a DWM manufactured gun because DWM was the only facility making them after 1914. The serial numbers fit the standard pattern of German military Lugers. So we've got the full serial number down here on the front of the frame. They were done in units of 1,000 with letter suffixes, and those serial number ranges reset every year. So 1917 started with 1A and went up. I have 837C here. And then 1918, they would restart again with 1A. And we've got our Imperial German proof marks here on the right side of the gun. So I'm not going to go over all the details of the Luger. Everything else mechanically is just like a standard P08. The holster that was made for these is a combination of holster and stock. So we have a flat board stock here that clamps onto the back of the pistol, and I'll show you that in a moment. It has a piece of leather that is screwed onto the stock here, which loops around and attaches to the same tab that holds the holster closed. That's to hold the holster onto the stock, because this entire thing goes on your belt as a single unit. At the front, we have a little protective leather cap here, so I can undo that, and then, be gentle with this. This is the stock attachment lug. We have a lever on this side that locks the holster in place, so you can see it doing its thing down there. Flat to slip onto the pistol, and then you rotate it like that, and it locks it in place. And the stocks are numbered to match the guns, so this is the correct matching stock. To put this on, we're just going to drop that into the lug and rotate it down, hold this out of the way, and then pop that lever up, and it locks on, actually, nice and tight. It may seem a little bit awkward to have all this leather paraphernalia hanging off the stock. This could all be detached. You could pretty easily slip the stock out of the holster assembly. We would do that by lifting up this tab. That is going to allow the holster to lift off like so. Notice we have this attachment here, which allows you to more firmly attach the holster into the stock. Also worth pointing out, inside here, we actually have the sling coiled up in there. You have a takedown or a magazine loading tool in here. You have a cleaning rod in here. So all the extra tools that you would need are built into the holster. This stays on the holster. This is screwed to it, as is this flap. But it's a very thin board stock, but it certainly does the job of giving you an adequate length of pull and a nice shoulder rest on which to, well, with which to fire the gun nice and accurately. Now, when the Sturmtruppen started using these, the limitation that became readily apparent was in the 8-round magazine. And so that's when they developed this 32-round drum magazine. It's got the same stick as a standard magazine, so it loads in there just as you would expect. This makes for a kind of awkward looking package, but this just kind of hangs down below the gun, and it's a bit of a compromise, but to have the extra ammunition capacity, it's well worth it. These drums were also issued with a loading tool because the spring tension in here is really quite strong. To wind the thing up, you have to actually extend this handle because it's really tight. You can load the first handful of rounds into this without a loading tool, but in order to fill it, you really have to have that tool. And it's just a lever that gives you some extra strength to push the follower down. So like I said, 32 rounds total. This actually, once it's wound up, acts as an indicator for how much ammunition you have left. It's a little hard to see, but we have 32 there, 22 remaining there, 17, I think there's a 27. So every 5 rounds, you can indicate down to 12 rounds right here, and you've got 12 rounds between there and the top of the magazine. These would go on to be used in the MP18. In the MP18, there was a much shorter magazine well, so there's a spacer that went on them. These were also issued with a magazine cover to protect the feed lips and to keep gunk out of them, since a bunch of spare magazines were issued with every Stormtrooper's LP08. I mentioned that a lot of these were made. Well, here you go, almost 500,000 serial number right here. There were a couple different companies that made the drums, but those sorts of details are a subject for a later video. So you might wonder where this was in World War II, if it was such a revolutionary and effective design in World War I. And the answer is the pistol caliber carbine was basically replaced by the submachine gun right at the very end of World War I. So Germany adopts the MP18, and by World War II, anyone who was in a position to have needed or been really well suited to having something like this, well, they probably got an MP40 instead, or an MP38. These were not in Germany's frontline small arms inventory in World War II, so you don't see them produced during the war. There was a little bit of production after World War I. Of course, the Treaty of Versailles put strict limitations on what Germany could produce in the way of arms, and long-barreled pistols were recognized as an effective military thing, and they were severely controlled. There was a little bit of production of long-barreled Lugers, mostly for the American commercial market in the 1920s. There were a couple small orders that were fulfilled by Mauser, which took over from DWM and Luger production in the 30s. Interestingly, well, so those orders are like there was one for Iran, there was one for Thailand, Siam, and those were largely fulfilled using leftover existing DWM production barrels that were already kind of in new old stock condition. So that's about all you'll see for production of the artillery Luger after World War I, because it was replaced by the submachine gun. So to my mind, these are a really cool element of World War I small arms development. One of the few, there weren't a whole lot of weapons in World War I that saw a lot of evolution during the course of the war, and this is one of them. So this, along with a couple other examples of the type, is coming up for sale at Rock Island in April, the end of April. So you can check out their pictures and description of this particular one, or check out their catalog for the other artillery Lugers in there, as well as everything else they've got for sale. Thanks for watching.